50th anniversary of the UNESCO Biosphere programme globally, although the Isle of Man has only been a member of the World Network for 5 years. And back last winter, we were approached by 2 Irish biospheres, the 2 biospheres in Ireland, Kerry and Dublin Bay, to say, could we all collaborate as fairly near neighbours on a webinar series which will allow us to kind of learn a little bit from each other. Learning is one of the 3 central pillars of biosphere: sustainable development, conservation and learning. And so we came up with this idea of having a webinar each month. We take it in turns to host. We've hosted twice, and the one in September will be our 3rd. And people from all 3 biospheres tune into them and indeed watch them again, because they go up on YouTube afterwards, and hopefully, we're all learning from each other about aspects of our biosphere.
So up to this point, you said there's a 3rd one. So what were the other 2? What were we teaching?
Our first one was in March, and it was about the Calf of Man and the wonderful work that goes on there jointly between Manx Natural Heritage and the Manx Wildlife Trust. Calf, of course, is a British bird observatory, as well as being very geologically significant. And so that was great. We had lots of different speakers on that one. In June, we hosted one on our 10 marine nature reserves, and we had some fabulous video with our senior marine officer going around all the reserves and sort of talking about the creatures that lie in the deep and the stuff that we don't see, and some fab video. I really recommend you watch that. So September is our 3rd one.
Okay, so we now got this one coming up, the making and remaking of each day, sharing the stories of our shores. Breesha, you're going to be delivering it. A great title.
Oh, thank you. It changed many times, as they always do. But it's really just a reminder that culture's part of biosphere, that people are part of the biosphere, so culture's everything we do. So it's talking about the stories that we all have around us in the Isle of Man, particular ones that we might inherit from friends and family, also from legend and myth, and how a lot of the work that we do at Culture Vannin is trying to share those stories, because we think that stories actually stick in your heart space. You can be told something and it'll go into your brain. It might stick, it might not. But how do you actually really care about something? How do you care deeply? How do you connect with it? And it's by telling stories, whether they're of Manannan living on the top of South Barrule and rolling down the hill, or whether it's a story that your grandmother told you or that your friend told you. And it's what we remember and what we forget that is important.
And do you have some that have stuck with you, but especially I think through your family? Have you got some that have really sort of stayed with you?
Yes, I had a wonderful grandmother who was called Doris Catherine McGain. She didn't like the name Doris, so she liked to be called Doris Catherine. And she was a brilliant storyteller. She could tell you stories that nestled within each other, so they were like the Russian dolls, but she wouldn't tell you the end of the first story until she's told you all the other stories in the middle. And she grew up in Cregneash, and so she encountered a lot of people that we would only read about. So to do with the Manx language, she knew Harry Kelly, and her father used to read to Harry Kelly in English so that he could get some into his head, but he didn't want too much because he was such a good Manx speaker. He said, that's enough of the English now. She had the visit of Norwegian linguist Carl Marstrander, who noted down some Manx language quite early on. Eamon de Valera, who came over and then brought the Irish Folklore Commission, who triggered recording a lot of the last native speakers. So she's around with all these, but she grew up in Cregneash with this wonderful community of people. Her father was full of fun, had boats that he was sailing around, and he would come back into port, and he and his friends would go and swap the doormats round on people's houses. They'd go into the best friend's house, they'd just go in, the table's set, they'd go and eat the dinner, and then they'd go out, wash up and put it all back and go out again. So there was a tremendous sense of fun, and she knew lots of really great characters, and so she'd tell you all these stories. And when I came back from university to do my PhD here, I spent many an hour sitting in her kitchen, which is where all the best guests went, because if people could take you as they found you, they were the right people to have in. And she would tell me wonderful stories, everything from ghostly ships appearing on the horizon that 2 old men of Cregneash had seen, and on the deathbed of one of them, he turned to his friend and he said, it's right what we saw that night, wasn't it? Because they saw it, and these black ships and sails appeared and then disappeared in an instant. And so she'd tell you quite otherworldly things as well.
That's fantastic.
And she was a great storyteller, so I was very lucky.
Do you think this is where because you have such a deep-rooted connection to the island, don't you? Do you think this is maybe where it began when you were a child, maybe listening to her?
I think your connection with culture comes from your community, and whether that's your family or whether that's your friends or whether that's the networks around you, it doesn't matter. but it's having a sense of place. I always think that people who choose the Isle of Man, it doesn't matter if they're born here or if they've come here, it's who chooses the Isle of Man and who chooses to be connected. And there's a different way that you can be connected. You can find your connection. It doesn't have to be the same way as someone else. And that's what's wonderful about culture. It's personal expression. And you'll listen to a story and get something from it. And I'll listen to it and I'll get something different. And that's great because all those layers are just brilliant.
And tell you what has caught my eye as well, the field names, from sea gods to field names. Now, I'm assuming it's exactly that, because I know I've spoken to some characters out when I've been out and about doing things, and some parts, literally, some of these fields, of course, it's down in such and such, and you think, where, sorry? And it's not the name of an area or a sheeting, it's actually the name of a field.
Yeah. We have really, really localised names. So farms will have specific field names. They're recorded in the archives at the Manx Museum, but a lot of them are not recorded. And some of them become almost rhythms between languages. They might have started off in Manx and they might be going towards English, but they're in this strange space between, and that's a really interesting place for them to be. But they might describe why that field's important. It might describe what the sandy soil, so it's a different sort of thing. And they give a sense of people deeply understanding the land, and I think that's very important in our farming community, to see them as guardians of the land and a very important part of Biosphere.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly that. I think maybe in our modern culture now we have sort of become slightly once removed from that connection to the land to a degree, haven't we, the way a lot of us live now.
Then there are wonderful people out there who are willing to talk about them, and we capture some of them on video. And that's a great way to tell those stories in a new way to new audiences. Because ordinarily, I wouldn't know that field over there in your farm is good for cows and that there's a hare's gap in that. But because somebody was willing to talk about their farm, you can get insight into that. And I think that's the importance of knowing that the way we tell stories also changes over the years. Whereas we used to think of farmland in particular going down into the guardianship of the next generation all the time, that doesn't always happen now. So we need to learn to tell stories in new ways.
Sounds absolutely fascinating, doesn't it?
though?
Right up your street, Christy.
Do you know what? Genuinely, it is fascinating. If this is just a flavour of what this webinar is going to be, how do people actually sort of take part in this then, Jo? How does it work? How does the webinar work?
So we run them on Zoom, talking about new ways of telling stories. That's kind of taken over the world, hasn't it, in terms of how we're all communicating these days. And you can sign up via the biosphere.im website. Just go to the news and events section there. It's completely free of charge. It's on Tuesday the 28th of September at 12:30. And after Breesha has spoken, there'll be time for questions, and we will have a bit of lively chit chat with the guys over in Dublin and Kerry, and tell a few stories amongst us as well. So